So what I want to do now leading up to lunch is talk about the major challenges and opportunities for the gospel in your context. We've already talked about the prosperity gospel a fair bit yesterday. So what I want to do now is invite you guys to talk to each other, and then we'll all talk together about Islam. When we talk about other religions, it's incredibly important that we're respectful and that we also never demean people. We criticize ideas. So in other words, let's talk about Islam as a religion, not Muslims that you might know and be belittling or anything like that. I think we should have a tone of respect and care. But here's what I want you to do. In groups of three, the groups that you were in earlier, talk about the presence of Islam, either in Addis or in Ethiopia in the context that you're in, and maybe use that grid. What are things that you see as areas to enter in, to explore, to expose, and to evangelize? How much, I'm curious, how much would you guys say that my studies of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, again, from a distance, I would not have classified that as a prosperity gospel movement. Would you say they're different too? Yeah. So we have prosperity gospel, we have Ethiopian Orthodox, we have the presence of Islam, and then we have some other stuff. Is that fair? Is that good? So two groups here. So this is good. We'll have two groups on Islam, two groups on the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So you guys can do Islam, you guys can do Islam, and you guys do the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in two different groups. Okay? So use the grid, but it doesn't have to be as elaborate as you did in Acts 17, but let's just surface what are the challenges and opportunities for the gospel. Use the grid that I gave you. Talk about those things. We'll come back in 10 or so minutes and we'll just spend some time talking about it, and then I'm going to walk you through some teaching on secularism as well. Okay? Sound good? Alrighty, well this group merged into one, so why don't we start with the Ethiopian Orthodox, and how do I pronounce, is it Taiwahedo? Taiwahedo? I did a major paper in my THM program on Abuno Paulos. He was the bishop of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the 80s and 90s, but he did his PhD at Princeton Seminary, the same place that I did my THM, and his journey, completely independent of the faith and the church itself, he was a very significant leader in the church, and then he went to Princeton to get his PhD. And then while he was studying for his PhD, there was some kind of civil war that broke out in Ethiopia, so he came back to be a leader of the church during that very hard time. He ended up in prison and was in prison for 8 years or something like that. And then he moved back to Princeton to finish his degree. So that story for the Princeton community of watching this person who was a student, very loved, then go and was jailed and then came back, very dramatic story. So that's what I wrote about. But all to say, I have a little bit of exposure to that church. In terms of evangelism and apologetics, I think it would be great if you guys, for example, had opportunities to connect with people who lead or attend that church. That would be incredibly hard ground to do evangelism in, especially if someone's committed. I think where you guys could have a lot of evangelistic and apologetic success, to use that word, is by seeing people who still have an inclination towards spirituality, but who are burnt out or hurt or frustrated because of their experiences in the Orthodox Church. And that's not meant to be so much a criticism of the Orthodox Church as much as it is to say those people are longing for something that they're not finding in that church because they're not leading with the gospel as we understand it. And that's where you guys could be super effective in saying, here's how the way we understand Scripture and the gospel can actually speak into those longings, but in a way that looks really different than the kind of Christianity that you're used to or the kind of Christianity that you grew up experiencing. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. So in London, we have a lot of that with the Church of England. The Church of England is not at all like the Orthodox Church, but what it is, it's a inherited traditional religion that's passed on from parent to child. So some people grow up in that, and in certain contexts will say, that's not working for me. I'm tired of the corruption, the institutionalism, the whatever, or even the weak doctrine that sometimes is present. And those people say, I don't know where to go, I don't know where to look. And you want to say, oh, actually, you don't have to run from God. Actually, the things you're feeling, there's actually a home for you. and let me tell you about it. So that's what I mean. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it's one thing to talk about the structure in the church itself and its official doctrine, and that would get you more into the realm. So like if one of you met with your equivalent in that church, you know, a intern, a leader, someone like that, you would have like a really rich discussion about doctrine, about ministry practice. That would be very interesting. There's probably a ton of people in this city who have some connection to the Orthodox Church, but for whatever reason don't find it to be a home for them. And I think that's where you guys could have a lot of evangelistic fruitfulness, by interacting with those people and showing them how the gospel as you understand it is far more compelling and beautiful and engaging than what they might have experienced in the church that they went to when they were a kid. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's important, because that's kind of what Paul's doing in Acts 17, is he's appealing to texts that the Athenians would have found authoritative. So what you want to do is be able to say, how do we present the gospel in ways that would be understandable and engaging and compelling to people who might not think of the authority of the Bible as something that they could accept? There's still ways to do it. And eventually you would need to get to the authority of the Bible. Like, you can't be a disciple of Jesus and not believe in the authority of Scripture, but it may not be your entry point. You know, it's really good. So I think what I'm trying to say with this conversation is I think you guys gave a really, really, really good overview of what subversive fulfillment looks like. The things to affirm, the transcendence, the reverence, the things where you might see some idolatry, maybe veneration. I wonder too if there's some idolatry in the traditionalism or the familial nature. Oh, I would never leave this church because this is my family's church, you know, that stuff. So there's things there that you can expose, absolutely. You talked about evangelism, how the gospel heals legalism. That was beautiful. And so I think, you know, especially when it comes to people who would say we want to follow Jesus or we do want to follow God, your apologetic with them needs to be really humble, really charitable, really respectful, but also really bold to say, you've missed some of the most beautiful things about the gospel. Let me invite you into a conversation about what they could be. So let's talk about, this is very different. Let's talk a little about Islam and its presence in the city. Yeah, so you're finding entry points to kind of press in and sort of expose how the core tenets of Islam may not lead to this sort of joy and peace and love that we think we find in the gospel. I think especially when it comes to people who are pretty committed or devoted to other faiths, whether it's something like Islam or even if you would classify the Orthodox Church as another faith, if someone's pretty committed, it's pretty hard to, I would say, win them to Christ by arguments or by comparing doctrine. And the reason for that is the fundamental different starting point. But what you can do is, we're just talking about, can sort of start to uncover and expose the false assumptions and the false pictures they might have of Christianity or of Christians. And you do that in relationship. So we haven't talked a lot this week about relational evangelism, and we're not gonna, but the basic idea is that sometimes evangelism and apologetics is best accomplished inside of a friendship or inside of a relationship. So rather than, an event that you would do and you would invite people to come to your event and just listen to a presentation, that might be interesting to some, but actually if you go to your gym and you start building friendships with people, that's going to create context for evangelism that will be much more fruitful. So it's always paying attention to those relationships. I think that's especially true when you're talking about different religions, because people, the same ways that you would not be prone to want to convert to another religion, that's true for your Muslim friends or the people in the Orthodox Church. And so you'll have much more space to speak about these things in the context of a friendship. So, good. Well, guys, I don't feel myself to be an expert in any of those areas, but what you're telling me, what Josh told me, is they're going to be really important for your ministry. So I hope that these conversations have been a little helpful as you think about what ministry in Addis will look like, with whether it's the Orthodox Church, New Age, Islam, with these things, the prosperity gospel, with these things as sort of undercurrents in the water. And I would encourage you to pay special attention to people who maybe have those communities as part of their background, but they've disconnected from it. And this is what I want to talk about now. Do you see on page 12, not only do we talk about prosperity gospel, Islam, we could add the Orthodox Church, but what we have there is that phrase called deconstruction or agnosticism. Do you know what that word deconstruction means? Yeah. So deconstruction is a pretty modern term, although people have been doing it for a while, that refers to the process, as you've said, of dismantling some or all of the beliefs that you have had, usually occasioned by some kind of negative experience that a person has gone through. So deconstruction can happen in almost any religion, but what it would mean is you have gone through something that causes you to question the core tenets of your faith. So you begin looking at them, and as you pick them apart, you begin to realize that actually the whole thing is less reliable or less certain than I once thought it might be, and you deconstruct. Is deconstruction always bad? No, it's not. But it can be dangerous, so we need to talk about it. So a couple thoughts on deconstruction, because as a pastor, there's a really healthy component of deconstruction, but what becomes dangerous is when people in your churches start to deconstruct, and in the process they disconnect from the church, and that's what you want to avoid. So a couple thoughts. Number one, when you're talking about deconstruction, you never want to communicate an attitude of judgment to the people who are deconstructing. Remember we talked earlier, or yesterday, feels like a long time ago, but yesterday, about secular 3. Do you remember? Secular 3 was living in a world in which multiple and competing beliefs and worldviews are plausible. Remember we said that? If that's true, that means, as I said yesterday, doubters will believe and believers will doubt. So we're all Thomas now. Do you remember doubting Thomas? Show me the wounds. I need some proof. I need something to back up what I believe. Everybody is a Thomas now in a secular world, in the secular 3 kind of age, which means that lots of people that fill this room on a Sunday, at one point or another, are going to go through their own experiences of deconstruction. If you as the leaders communicate that that's not okay, that it's not safe, that you should never doubt or you should never be tempted to deconstruct, they're still going to do it. They're just going to run away while they do it. They're just going to leave the church. So you want to create an attitude or a culture that says, if you doubt, if you have questions, if you are tempted to evaluate or examine the core tenets of our faith or your experiences of the church or what you've been passed on from your parents, let's help you. Let's journey together. Let's be in conversation and make this part of our discipleship. So I'd encourage you to be proactive in creating an awareness in your community that doubt is not bad, that you're not going to be judged if you have questions about even the most basic parts of the faith. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is oftentimes, from a pastoral perspective, people begin or want to deconstruct because of circumstances that have triggered doubt or hurt in their life. So if someone comes to you and says, I'm just really not sure that I can trust in the authority of the Bible anymore, if your instinct is to get them B.B. Warfield, I don't know who you guys read on scripture, but Warfield's great. So if you get them B.B. Warfield and be like, boom, read this book, we're going to talk about it, let's have coffee, you probably miss what's really going on. But if you were patient and you asked some questions, you might discern that there's some sort of suffering or some kind of spiritual dryness or spiritual hurt that has occasioned or triggered their doubt. And so while the authority of the Bible might be their presenting issue, the reality is something underneath gave occasion to that. So someone I know tells this story about how a friend who was a Christian, very mature Christian, and a Christian leader, someone who led others in the faith, started to deconstruct and ultimately left Christianity, said, I'm not a Christian anymore. And the reason for that was because he took the words of Jesus very seriously. So Jesus says, if you ask anything in my name, you'll have it. Jesus says that a few times. And this man, after years and years of praying for a very specific thing that he absolutely believed was aligned with God's will, didn't see any response from Christ, didn't see any answer to his prayer. What it did to him is it made him say, if I can't trust Jesus' words there, then how can I trust any of them? And he began to deconstruct and ultimately left the faith. Now, you could talk about prayer, but really what that person is saying is they've had something in their life that they are hurting in, an area where they've been suffering, and they wanted God to show up, and they didn't believe God did. So it doesn't mean a conversation about prayer and the nature of prayer isn't important, but it does mean if that's all you do, you probably miss the biggest thing that drove this process of deconstruction in the first place. So I would say you want to create a real pastoral, like a real sense pastorally that it's safe to bring doubt. You also want to be paying attention to the things that might be causing people to deconstruct. And then third, you want to pay attention to people who might be deconstructing other faiths and worldviews. So this is where, that's what I was trying to say earlier about the Orthodox Church, is that sometimes, in missiological terms, we have phrases like unchurched and dechurched. So unchurched are people who've just never been exposed to church or Christianity. Dechurched are people who have been and have said for whatever reason, that doesn't work for me, I'm out. Those people are often the most ripe for evangelism because they have some architecture for the faith and you have a chance to help them experience the gospel in a fresh and powerful way. So you want to be paying attention to people, like if you're at your gym, you're talking to somebody. There's a guy in our church now who comes from a West African country that is very, very, very hostile to Christianity. And he was part of another faith before. And he deconstructed his other faith. And it made him open to say, I still have these longings to know God. I still have these longings to be spiritual, but I know that it's not here. So he found our church via Zoom during the pandemic and said, can we have a coffee? And we did. And I was able to walk with him, not by saying, believe this, do that, but as a safe sounding board while he deconstructed from his previous journey and sort of then add in the pieces of the gospel that brought wholeness and real beauty. And he was baptized a few months ago. So that's the kind of thing that you just want to be sensitive to. That deconstruction isn't always bad. What is bad is when people disconnect from the community while they deconstruct, because God meets us in community. Any questions about deconstruction? Yeah, Issachar. Well, this is a tricky area when you start talking about what does a church do and what does a church practice, because I recognize that most of you, I think all of you, are part of this local church, right? Yeah, so in our church, what we say is people should always feel loved more than judged. And that's hard to manifest, but we always are trying to create spaces where people feel I can belong here, I'm accepted, they see me, they welcome me. That said, we have church membership. So we have people who just attend on a Sunday, and then we have membership. And we would say the bar for membership is, it's here. You have to believe certain things. You have to be able to articulate certain things about the nature of the gospel, the way in which you're following Jesus actively in your life. And so if you're part of the community, but don't share those convictions, we'd love to have you. Stay, be a part of what we're doing. Come to small group. Maybe you could even volunteer on the coffee team or something like that. Fine. But you're not ready for membership. In addition, we would say the bar for membership, while there is a bar, is much lower than the bar to be a pastor or an elder or a pastoral leader. So someone who leads a community group or someone who leads the kids ministry. So we would say that bar is much higher. So if you're a community group leader and you start questioning the validity of the resurrection, we'd say probably not the best time for you to be a CG leader. Doesn't mean you have to leave our church, doesn't mean we're going to walk with you, doesn't mean we don't want to be part of the journey with you, but this is a season to step back from leadership so that we can invest in this area of spiritual exploration together. The only time that I think a church ever has a right to create a sense of you're not welcome here is when that person poses physical or emotional threat to other people and or is so persistent in a sort of spirit of rebellion that they're unable to participate in the community without causing severe disruption. So an example would be someone who's so persistent in a doctrine that they just can't stop talking about it. Every person they meet, every person they talk to, every small group they attend, they're just always sidelining the conversation by trying to just ram this idea down people's throats. And again, you don't just get rid of them or ask them to leave quickly, but you have lots of conversations, you walk with them gently, but ultimately you may have to say, this just doesn't seem like it's the right home for you, because you're causing a lot more division than you are anything else. So my sense is that the bar for entry in terms of coming on a Sunday, being part of the worshiping community, participating in some activities, that bar should be really low, and we should be really welcoming and really accepting. And then recognize that as people go up in terms of level of commitment to the church, and especially level of leadership within the church, the bar gets much higher, as it should. So that's my response. Have I addressed your question, or not really? A little bit? Okay, good. And so every church has to figure that out for themselves and what that means. But I've been very much shaped by people who, at Redeemer, for example, we always used to say, we want to be a church for the city, not for ourselves. Meaning the goal of Sunday is not to just have this fun little club where we get together and sing all our favorite songs, but we are actively welcoming the city in, trying to help people meet Jesus. If you lead with judgment, that'll never happen. So you have to create a community of love, not one that is, soft on truth, but one that so at Redeemer, we always used to say we want to be a church that wears our doctrine well. And I love that phrase, wear your doctrine well. What does that look like, for any local church to figure that out? So, have you guys ever seen movie trailers? And the movie trailer says something like, coming soon to a city near you. You ever seen that or heard that? My sense is that if secularism isn't already here, and I bet it is, but if not, it's coming soon to a city near you. So what I want to do is spend some time talking with you about secularism, what it is and how it manifests itself in terms of spiritual or ministry contexts. And, I don't know that I'm an expert in this, but this was the area that my doctoral research focused on, was how pastoral care meets secularism. So I've thought a lot about it. Whether or not I'm an expert, who knows? But I've thought enough about it to say I think I have something to offer. And the challenge, though, of course, is I've never been here. Like, the context that you're in is very different. So you're going to have to listen and sort of try it on and say, does this fit? How might this change or adapt for a city like Addis? So I'm very much wanting to say that though I think aspects of this are here or will come very soon, you also need to be creative in how you apply what I'm saying, because it may not be perfectly fit. Okay, you with me? Does that make sense? Okay, so here we go. Yesterday we talked about a secular age. So that was Charles Taylor and some other people who have developed his ideas. And if you remember secular 3, one of the aspects of secular 3 is that we all now live in a world of contested beliefs, that there is no single dominant worldview or faith system that rules society. And I think that's true in most places. There may be some exceptions in the world. Even as we've talked about, even in a city like Addis, you have 40% people who identify as Muslim. I don't know how many people identify as Orthodox or Christian. So there's no dominant single worldview. But one of the things that has emerged during this emergence of secular 3, or this way of thinking about what it means to be secular today, is a few different strands or a few different cultural realities that impact people. And the biggest one is expressive individualism. So if you were to ask me, what is the main impact of secular 3 for people today? My answer would be expressive individualism. This comes from Charles Taylor, but I think he's absolutely right in identifying that one of the results of people feeling cross-pressure, the idea that we live with this tension of a pull towards the transcendent and yet a awareness that we live in an immanent or a natural world. One of the things that he says is the result of that is what he calls expressive individualism. Let me read to you a couple of things about that. You guys are with me, right? This is page 12 of the handout. Charles Taylor says this: the understanding of life which emerges within the romantic expressivism of the late 18th century, so that's Enlightenment period. Again, I know this is very Western, is that each of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity. Like that's it right there. That's what expressive individualism is. His or her own way of realizing our own humanity. And that it is important to find and live out one's own identity as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us by outside, by society, the previous generation, or religious or political authority. The problem with Charles Taylor is he writes terribly. So you read it and you have no idea what he's talking about. But in that paragraph is, I think, one of the most helpful summaries of what it means to be a young person today. And here's what he's saying. In the past, the way a person got an identity was usually either by looking to faith and religion or to the family. So I am what my religion tells me I am, or I am what my family says I am. So you build an identity based on your connections to something outside of you. You with me? That's how most of the world operated for most of history. Whether it was religion, whether it was philosophical ideas, whether it was political ideas, whether it was your own family. You are what X out there thinks of you. What has happened is that now we live in a world in which people's identity is increasingly formed not by looking up towards a god or gods, and not even by looking around to other people and family, but instead by looking within at your own urges, desires, and longings. So increasingly, the way we think of our identity is by looking at what we feel and expressing that into the world. That's what expressive individualism means. It's a way of cultivating identity formation by encouraging people to reject authority structures or imposed identities and to instead look within, see what's there, and then express that out in the world. Carl Trueman, was a professor at Westminster Seminary. And by the way, he has a book on the shelf called Strange New World. If you've not read it yet, that's the book that unpacks some of these ideas. Really helpful. This quote is from a different book, but nonetheless, it's there. So Strange New World, really good. Trueman says this: the ancient Athenian was committed to the assembly, the gathering of the philosopher. The medieval Christian to the church, the 20th century factor worker to his trade union and his working man's club. I don't know what the examples are in Addis. It might be the Orthodox Church. It might be family. What are the things that people maybe do or used to associate? And all of them, those people, found their purpose and well-being by being committed to something outside themselves. In the world of the psychological man, however, the commitment is first and foremost to the self and is inwardly directed, and her sense of inner well-being. So what's happened in society is we've flipped from saying my identity comes from my connections to something outside of myself to now my identity comes from within, and I only connect to the institutions or the authority structures that support whatever identity I've built for myself. Is this making sense? Yes, sir. Okay. Is this at all resonating? Is this happening in this city? A little bit? So let me give you another really silly example. Have any of you seen Frozen? The kids show, the kids movie? I have a little girl, so I've seen it about 10 billion times. I know literally every word of that show, the movie. I actually know every word of both of them. There's 2 movies. But anyway, do you know how the most popular song in Frozen 1, the first movie, is Let It Go? So Princess Elsa says, no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. That, yeah, somebody wants to sing. You know, that song, if you go on YouTube, has over 2 billion views. That's extraordinary. And young people's minds, little girls and boys, watching Elsa sing and singing that song, parents don't even realize, and we watch it with our kids, but we try to talk to her about it, that's cultural, that is discipleship, that is cultural formation under the doctrine of expressive individualism. Because what's going on with Elsa? Think about it. Elsa has this power, something inside of her, but her family and her society, they're ashamed of it. So they tell her, conceal, don't feel. Like, that's the song, if you know. Conceal, don't feel. But eventually she gets to the point in her life where she says, forget this. I'm tired of burying it. I'm just going to be who I am. And I'm going to express that to the world. So she goes off to her mountain castle, ice palace thing. She throws off her robe, and not like declothed, but like her little cape thing. And she sings, let it go. I'm free. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. What she's saying is this: I'm not going to listen to my family anymore. I'm not going to listen to my society. I'm going to be me. I'm going to do me. And our kids are just watching that and thinking that's the kind of person I want to become. That's an example of cultural formation, of discipleship that's happening in culture that wouldn't have happened 80 years ago. But it's happening now because of expressive individualism, that we celebrate and that we encourage people to reject and to ignore any projected identity and to assume one that is based on whatever we feel inside. My sense is that places like New York are probably a little bit ahead of a city like Addis, because I would imagine that traditional family-related structures of relating to each other still persist here. And I would imagine that those are still pretty dominant. My sense, though, is as the world becomes increasingly globalized, this secularism is going to become more and more a force, including and especially with young people who are very interconnected because of technology and social media. So what you'll have is a kind of crisis that emerges in society where the Elses of the world are saying to the parents, I'm free, let it go. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. Why don't we keep plowing through, and then we'll see if there's more conversation. If not, we'll move to our next part of today's, what we're talking about. But so when you go the next level down, you say, okay, so expressive individualism is out there, it's sort of in the air, it's in the drinking water of our culture, it's stuff that's impacting people. What does that mean practically? Well, a couple things. As pastors, you need to know this. If people's main way of thinking about who they are is individualistic, do you realize how dramatically that impacts the way you disciple them in churches? Because what happens when a person's MO in life is expressive individualism, they begin to prize optionality and they begin to fear commitment. So I don't want to commit to something good because something better might come along down the road. This is what Mark Dever calls commitment phobia, the fear of committing to something good because something better is going to come down the road, maybe in a week's time. This is why in places like New York and London, the average age of someone getting married has moved from like 23, 50 years ago to like 31. It's because people are keeping their options open longer. They're afraid to commit. They're afraid if I commit now, maybe I'll miss out on something a little bit better a few weeks or a few months or a few years from now. So optionality. Think about that for a church. Oh yeah, this is my church until I don't really like the pastor's sermons anymore. Or until the music starts sounding as good as it used to. Or until fill in the blank. This church has a better kids ministry or whatever. And so what people begin to do, because their whole life has been conditioned in this way, is they begin to relate spiritually to the church and even to God in a way that is marked by expressive individualism, where keep my options open, make as few commitments as possible. And so the journey of discipleship in this space is to help people see actually expressive individualism is going to destroy you. We talked a little bit about that earlier today. There's a second impact of expressive individualism, not just this idea that we're commitment phobic, but there's another thing that I think you should be paying attention to. And the best word that I can use to summarize it is apathy. Do you guys know the word apathy? Like a kind of, it's not really lazy, it's like an indifference. It's like kind of indifferent to anything. What a lot of people recently, sociologists have observed, is that the result of expressive individualism for a lot of young people is they're incredibly apathetic. All they want is an easy and an unbothered life. And they're looking to, in the Western world, we have a phrase, Netflix and chill. Like, I just want to chill and watch Netflix and I don't want to be bothered. Like, it's this idea that if it's hard, it must be bad. So people are always looking for ease, for comfort, for things that make life less inconvenient and more comfortable. I imagine in a city like Addis, that's a lot harder to find because life can be hard, especially as many of you described yesterday, if people are living below the poverty line. But again, these things may be true. Let me give you a couple of examples. Again, these are very Western examples, but you'll have to figure out how they apply. December of 2018, there was a person, not a Christian, who wrote an article for The Atlantic, which is a pretty well-regarded news magazine in America, but in the Western world. The article was titled, "Why Are Young People Having So Little Sex?" And what she studied was, that young people, so if you think about high school age students, the percentage of young people who were having sex was going down rapidly. And initially you would think, oh my gosh, that's great, like, abstinence and people aren't having sex. But what she did as she started to study is that these young people were choosing self-pleasure, so ways of self-gratifying, over having sex because young people didn't want to be bothered by all the emotional entanglements that went along with having a physical relationship with another person. So increases is pornography and self-gratification, and what decreases is actual sexual encounters between young people. We're not here today to talk about whether or not that's good. Obviously we believe in a biblical sex ethic, but the point of the article was that even when it comes to something like sexuality, young people were increasingly saying, yeah, I'll just, I don't want to be bothered with that. I don't want to be bothered with having a kind of complicated relationship with all the emotions and entanglements. Picking up on some of those themes, a year later, another woman wrote an article, this for Christianity Today, called Move Over, this is all in your handout, by the way, Move Over, Sex, Drugs, Ease is the New Vice. What she was saying was, in the past, the main thing that young people did to express their rebellion was they were having sex when they shouldn't, they were doing drugs, they were drinking too much, whatever. But now she says, kids don't want to be bothered with that. Drugs, too complicated. Drinking, nah, too risky. Sex, nah, I don't want to deal with the emotional entanglement. All kids want is ease. They want a life that is not uncomfortable, that is peaceful, that is unbothered. She says, one of the most seductive promises of a technological age is that our life should be unbothered. As our lives get easier, we're increasingly formed by the desire for ease. This promise of unencumbered living is perhaps the most insidious danger and also the one that we talk about the least. Do you guys see how contradictory this is to a life of discipleship? I mean, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. The cross is an instrument of death. Following Jesus is meant to be really hard. And yet, as you guys pastor for the next, God willing, 50, 60 years, well, I don't know how old you are. I mean, you could be very old in 60 years. Anyway, as you guys pastor for this next generation of life in the history of our world, lots of the people coming to your church are going to be shaped with these cultural undercurrents where they don't want to be bothered with the difficulties of discipleship. They don't want to be challenged to wrestle hard with the implications of what it means to follow Jesus. Instead, they're going to be more drawn to say, well, that church over there allows me to do X, Y, or Z, and they don't really make a big deal about it, so I'm just going to go over there because it's easier. We've been formed by individualism. We've been formed by apathy. And so if you guys are going to be good apologists, if you're going to be good at engaging the culture, it isn't just addressing things like, how do we talk about Islam? Or how do we talk about the prosperity gospel? How do we give evidences for the resurrection? One of your big challenges is going to be sitting down with someone who says, yeah, Jesus is cool. And you say, well, why aren't you prioritizing your Bible? Yeah, no. And they just don't care. They're just indifferent. It's just not that important to them. And you're going to have to develop skills to help them move from an attitude of apathy and individualistic perspectives on life to seeing Jesus as Lord and following him as costing everything. That's the apologetic challenge, I think, for our generation. This also, the last part of this paragraph on page 15, also talks about evangelism, that this is, again, an American study, the amount of people who would say, I'm a Christian, and I believe it's wrong to share my faith. You get that? I'm a Christian, and I believe that it's wrong to share my faith. That number is skyrocketing because people are shaped by apathy and individualism. I believe in Jesus. I love Jesus, but I don't want to make someone else uncomfortable. I don't want to press that onto them. So we have a generation of Christians that are increasingly apathetic about the call of Scripture to do evangelism, to share your faith. There's some statistics in here that back some of that up. So all to say, if it's not here already, this is a challenge that's coming to a city near you. Individualism, apathy, and all the challenges that are connected to it. And I would encourage you, as you think about apologetics, as you think about what it means to help people follow Jesus, you're going to have to wrestle with those challenges one way or another. So why don't we take some time for Q&A discussion about this, and then we're going to transition to talk about the cities. Any questions or comments, anything I can amplify or clarify? Yeah. You mean what kinds of things can you do to challenge and walk with people who are apathetic? It's a great question. I'll give two answers to that. Well, maybe three. One is, I don't know if you know the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's theologically a little bit outside of the stream that I think a school like this would represent. But he's got a really helpful little book called Pastoral Care. And in that book, he has a chapter called Spiritual Care for the Indifferent. And it's a really fascinating chapter because he's actually going after the question of how do pastors provide care for people who are apathetic, who are indifferent about their spiritual life. So I have a summary of that somewhere. Maybe I can send it to Josh and share it with you guys because I know you probably don't have that book on your shelves. So that's something I can do. The second thing I would say is this. If a person is apathetic, one of the main things that you can try to do, this would be my main encouragement, and you get this a little from Bonhoeffer, is you have to bring them into the community. It's very hard to convince somebody with ideas to rouse them out of their apathy. Like, oh, Jesus says, follow me, it's take up your cross. Those ideas sometimes don't move people. They're like, whatever. But when you put somebody in a community of faith where they're actually experiencing the kind of contagious nature of faith and joy in Jesus, that starts to spur people on. So you'll see on Thursday, we're going to talk a lot about community. I think the formation of healthy communities in the church is probably the most important apologetic tool of our generation. Because yes, you can do a lot of doctrinal work in communities, and I don't just mean community groups, I mean just friendships, Christians doing life together. But you also are able to accomplish things like the priesthood of all believers, the contagious nature of faith, serving the city, showing a divided world the unity that's possible in the gospel. All those things only happen in community. And so my main counsel would be, if you're finding people who are spiritually indifferent, find ways to get them into the community. And that may not mean, hey, come to this class about the Trinity, as important as that would be, but it might mean come to this, I don't know what the equivalent would be, barbecue. We're going to eat, come to this potluck and let's hang out. And you just start really helping that person find themselves rubbing shoulders with other Christians. That's one of the ways that you sort of etch away at apathy. There's some other things I could say, but that would be the main one that I would encourage, is see the importance of community and bringing them along into community. It's one of the most powerful tools to help people get a vibrancy in their faith. That's assuming the community is healthy. If the community is unhealthy, that's a different story. Yeah, what I would encourage you to see is that actually that person, even if their deconstruction is maybe not very intellectual, they're still deconstructing because of cultural influences, which is, it's cool to do it, or everybody around me is doing it. So they're still very much being shaped by the culture. They're still being formed by the culture, in which case I would say you want to do the same thing that you would do in any context of deconstruction. You want to be very present. You want to be very pastoral, so gentle, and then you need to be appropriately firm. So when someone's saying, if you're walking with someone and they're kind of making up things that you think are excuses, that's not valid, that's silly, it's not wrong to say, actually, hey man, that doesn't seem very serious here. It seems like you're grasping at straws, you know better than that. But you can only do that in the context of a relationship in which they know they're loved and they're safe. If you do that too quickly or too brashly, you're going to alienate them and push them away. So there's a lot of that going on. If you're really interested in the topic of deconstruction, do you guys know the Gospel Coalition? So Josh Butler had an article, I don't remember the title, but I think if you just Google Josh Butler, Deconstruction, the Gospel Coalition, I think you'll find it. Some of you can do that now and tell everybody else the title. But the article is really good because he gets into that. He gets into this idea that sometimes people deconstruct just because they feel like if they're not deconstructing, they don't fit in with their friends. And he gives some guidance about that. So, yeah. So I can answer that like this. Absolutely. If we were doing this class 100 years from now, there'd probably be new challenges to pay attention to, new ways of talking about these things. The only thing that I want to say is that post-Christianity is different than pre-Christianity. So for example, the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks prior to Jesus would have had some of the same ideas that we have now in secularism, individualism. But what's different is that they had no conscious memory of a faith or a gospel or a version of Christianity that we now, as post-Christian people, if someone is that, have moved beyond. So what I'm trying to say is that even though the situation in the future may look different than today, it's going to look different in a way that depends upon what happened today. It's not going to go back to like the ancient Roman world because we can't. We can't unlearn or forget all the things that we've picked up as a humanity over the past now 2,000 years. So yes, we might move forward into a time where people come back into communal living and come back into the importance of family identity, sure, but it's not going to be the same as it was pre-Enlightenment. It's going to be a new version of that incorporates things that we picked up along this journey. That's always how it goes. So Charles Taylor in his book says history zigs and zags. It's never a straight linear line. We go backwards a little, then we come this way, then we go back again, we come this way. But the future is never an exact replica of the past. It might look like the past, but it has remnants of the things we've picked up on our journey. Does that make any sense? So I don't know. Smarter people than I might know what's coming down the road. I just know that we're never going to be fully rid of the impact of the Enlightenment and secularism. Part of that is because of technology. Like I can never imagine a less connected world. Like the future for Addis is better internet, right? Like, it's not going to get worse, it's going to get better as time goes on. And that's going to be true, and that's going to make the world even more interconnected.